Okay, welcome to this session of Biology Review webinars. We're going to be covering all three sections of Chapter 18 from the biology textbook. And just so you know, there's practice questions on the screen. So if you're here live, we want you to answer those practice questions. They're not being graded. They don't have to be submitted or anything. But we do want you to participate because it just helps us to see if we're doing a good job of teaching this, if most of the students are getting the correct answer when we do the practice questions. And if I need to go back and review anything, it'll let me know that maybe some students are getting mixed up. And it also keeps you, focused and helps you to test yourself and see if you are learning from this lesson. So if you're watching a recording of it later, just do the practice questions kind of with us, go along at home. And otherwise, if you're here live, then you can answer them. Okay, so let's get started. This is Chapter 18 from the biology textbook, and this is about classification. This chapter is about ways that we try to organize the overwhelming variety of living things in the world. In the Linnaean classification system, organisms are sorted into big groups, and then those big groups are broken down into smaller and smaller groups. Organisms that share a smaller group are more closely related than organisms that only share a large group but are not in the same smaller group. So two trees are more closely related than a tree and a fern. But a tree and a fern, because they are in this group together, are still more closely related than a tree and a moss. So that's the basic idea, and the system just described is called the Linnaean classification system. The process of using biological characteristics to determine which groups organisms should be in is called systematics. And the groups that we organize the organisms into are called taxa. So any size group could be called a taxa. Now there are 7 main levels of grouping, or 7 levels of taxa. They are the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So this is the 7 layers that we use to organize all of the organisms in the world. So kingdom is really broad, it's very general, there's lots of very diverse organisms in it, and then we start narrowing it down to be more specific, breaking kingdoms up into phylums, breaking phylums up into classes, and so on until we get down to an individual species. And there are 6 kingdoms. The organisms in different kingdoms are extremely different from each other. Animals, plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, and archaea are the 6 kingdoms that make up all of life. So let's focus on the kingdom of animals for our examples of the other levels. So differences in important characteristics determine how the groups are broken up. So all of these animals on the screen are part of the kingdom of animals. But the ladybug is different from the rest of them because it does not have a spinal cord. So it is in a different phylum than the others. So you see when we move from the level of kingdom to phylum, it got smaller. The ladybug is not included in this phylum. It's becoming more specific. It's less inclusive. So the remaining animals, the ones in this phylum, have a spinal cord. The fish has a spinal cord, so it's in this group, but other characteristics put it in a different class than the rest. The remaining animals are in the class of mammals, but different characteristics sort them into different orders, families, genus, and species. So we're just getting more specific, showing things that are more closely related as we move through these levels. And in this species, you see dogs and wolves are shown together because they are actually the same species. Humans domesticated some wolves long ago and bred them for different characteristics, which results in the different type of dogs that we have today. So this system is the best that we have for organizing everything, figuring out what is related to what. But this system is not perfect. Life can be very complex, and the divisions between different levels of taxa can be very hard to define. Sometimes you'll see additional levels, such as superfamily or subspecies. For example, we just said dogs and wolves are the same species, but because dogs have such different traits that we've selected for, they're actually considered their own subspecies within that species. Scientists also continually reclassify organisms as they find out more about them. So we organize things based on the information that we have, and as we get more information, sometimes we've got to rethink that organization. DNA evidence and a better understanding of evolutionary relationships can cause scientists to rethink how some of the organisms are grouped. For example, scientists considered there to be one species of gorilla with 3 subspecies until 2001, when a study of their mitochondrial DNA led them to be reclassified as 2 separate species, each with their own subspecies. So that's just a single example. You don't have to memorize that about gorillas. It's just an example of how, as we get more information, we can reclassify things into different levels. Now, the official scientific name of every organism consists of 2 words, the name of its genus and species. For example, wolves are in the genus Canis, and their species name is Lupus, making their name Canis lupus. That's the official scientific name for a wolf. The first word in their name is always capitalized, and the second word is always lowercase. This whole system is called binomial nomenclature. Okay, so binomial nomenclature is a fancy way to say 2 names. The system was developed by a scientist named Carolus Linnaeus in the 1700s, and though classification has changed a lot since then, the basic binomial nomenclature idea has persisted. This is the way that all organisms in all kingdoms are named. So we might be familiar with the scientific names of some animals, but everything is named this way with genus and species. For example, Propionibacter shermani is the genus and species name of a bacteria that helps us make Swiss cheese. Now, this brings us to the end of this section. So we're going to have a couple review questions. Which one of these is limited to organisms that are most closely related? So we've got all these different groups that have different levels of inclusiveness. Which ones limit it to the ones that are most closely related? Order, family, genus, or kingdom? The ones that are most closely related would be genus. So let's just review this idea. So these are our 7 levels. The ones at the top are most diverse. They include very distant relations. Remember, the animal kingdom has everything from wolves to ladybugs to fish. They're all over the place. And then we get more specific and more closely related till we go down until we get to genus, which is very closely related, and species, which is just one individual species of animal. And we have another review. This one's not a poll because I needed to leave the picture and the information on the screen. So this one, when the question comes up, we'll just think about it and then I'll give you the answer. So the 9-banded armadillo, this little guy on the screen, belongs to all of these taxa. There's this kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So what would we name it? What is the scientific name of this organism? So here's some multiple choice. I'm going to give you about 15-20 seconds to think about it, and then we'll go over what the answer is. All right, so when we name an organism, the scientific name is based on its genus and species. So all of these other words are important for classifying it, but they're not part of its official scientific name, just genus and species. So that means its name is going to be Decippus novemcinctus. Sorry, it's a little hard to say. Um, and I threw in two confusing answers here. C and D, they both say the same thing. So what's wrong with D? Remember that when you name things, the first word, the genus word is capitalized, and the species is not. So D is not correct just because of the capitalization, but C is your correct answer. Put the genus with a capital letter and then the species. Okay, so we're going to move on to section 2 of this chapter. Linnaeus began the classification system just by looking at traits of modern organisms, but once Darwin's theory of evolution was established, the focus of systematics became determining the evolutionary relationships of organisms, thinking about which is related to which and which came from certain ancestors. So we can think of it like this. No modern group of organisms just suddenly appeared on the planet. Instead, they evolved from species that already existed, and those species evolved from older species that already existed, all the way back to the first species that formed on Earth. So every organism shares a common ancestor with every other organism on the planet. We just need to figure out where they branched off and which is more closely related to each other. Organisms that organisms that are similar shared a common ancestor more recently than organisms that are very different. And the study of all these relationships is called phylogeny. So again, just looking at the diagram, the idea here is that there was some organism that was an ancient ancestor of every type of creature that exists today. Okay, so this is just looking at animals, because if we looked at all the kingdoms together, plants and protists and fungi, it would just be too huge. You couldn't fit it all on the screen. So we just went with animals. So some predecessor is a common ancestor of everything that exists, and then other things branched off of it, and we get all these different groups. But at each point, there's still a common ancestor of everything that branched off to the right. So for example, at this point, something like this lived, and everything to the right of it branched off of that. So everything here is a descendant of this. Okay, and then more recently, an organism like this lived, and that's at this point. And to the right of it, you have mammals and lizards and other reptiles. So those all descended from a creature like this. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. A group of organisms that share a common ancestor is called a clade. Okay, so this is an important word for the next couple of slides. Clades can be of any size. You've got closely related organisms would have a fairly small clade, and distantly related organisms would have a very large clade. For example, on the left is the clade of all big cats. So there was some species of large cat, and they all evolved from that. On the right is the clade of all carnivores. So you can see, I know it's small, but it's much more diverse. It includes the big cats, but it also includes less closely related organisms such as bears and skunks and seals. They did all derive from a common ancestor long ago, but it was more distant, more time has elapsed since then, since this common ancestor that just produced all of the cats. And another word that basically means the same thing, another word for a group of all of the descendants of a single common ancestor is a monophyletic group. So we're going to stick with using the word clade because it's shorter and they pretty much mean the same thing, but you should know both of those words. We show evolutionary classification using diagrams called cladograms. A cladogram shows a variety of organisms that evolved from a common ancestor. Each time an important trait developed, there is a branch on the cladogram creating a new clade. Everything shown before that trait does not have the trait, and everything after it does. For example, a species of organisms developed a spinal cord. Everything to the left of it over here, you can think of this as a divider. Everything to the left does not have a spinal cord. And everything from the right evolved from a common ancestor here that had a spinal cord, so they all have spinal cords, everything to the right. But for organisms that have spinal cords, more traits evolved that created more branches. So it's not just one path of everything with a spinal cord. You see lots of branches coming off to different groups. Fish have spinal cords, but fish do not have legs. Having 4 legs is a trait that creates a new clade within the spinal cord clade. More derived characteristics evolved to make more specific clades. The traits that develop in some species and cause these branches are called derived characters. So all of these traits written here, spinal cord is a derived character, 4 legs is a derived character, having feathers, having fur, having amniotic eggs, those are all derived characters that cause a branch where once it evolves, everything after that will have that trait. But then there's other organisms that evolve in a different direction without that trait. So let's look at another example of a cladogram and interpret it a little. So each dot here is called a node, and that shows a derived character, which means that each node represents a trait that evolved. We could start a new clade at any of the derived character nodes. So for example, we could start right here, and everything to the right of it is in that clade. Remember, that means all of these organisms at one point had a common ancestor. So the common ancestor has this derived character, and then everything to the right will have evolved having that trait. We can go back to an earlier node and show an even bigger clade, and earlier and show an even bigger clade. Each node gives an even bigger clade because it's all inclusive. Everything from that point to the right is part of the clade. And we can see that this group over here started on a branch and then split from them with its own derived characteristic. So we could point out a clade with just this one group. But any clade that contains this group over here will also contain this other group because it branched off from them. So the group that contains this is going to contain everything that branched off after it. So this just shows how this cladogram can be used to show general relationships, how recently things had a common ancestor, and what groups are related to each other more recently than others. Okay, so let's do a review, and this one is also going to be a poll. So I need I need you to see the figure here. So take a look at it before I bring the poll up on the screen. So according to this cladogram, which groups shared a common ancestor more recently and thus are more closely related? Mammals and reptiles or mammals and fish? Our correct answer is mammals and reptiles. So we can tell this because if we look at the cladogram, um, this would be the common ancestor for mammals and fish, would be back here. And fish branched off, and mammals and reptiles and birds. And then the common ancestor for mammals and reptiles, the most recent one would be here. And then off of that, mammals and reptiles, and then birds branched off. So they are more closely related than mammals and fish. So it's a pretty easy idea, I think, but I just wanted to make sure you understand the cladograms and the branching. And then we're almost to the end. We just have a little bit about section 3. So section 3 of this chapter 18 describes how changes have been made to the classification system. Linnaeus started with 2 kingdoms, but today we have 6, and these are the kingdoms on the screen. There's also actually been another category added above kingdom called domain. There are only 3 domains. So as we learned all the way back in chapter 7, all organisms who have a nucleus are called eukaryotes. And they, which are plants, animals, protists, and fungi, they all have eukaryotic cells. They're all eukaryotes. So they're in one domain called eukarya. Bacteria and archaea each get their own domain. So those are both prokaryotes, meaning they don't have a nucleus, but they're very different from each other in other ways, so they get their own domain. So we have 6 kingdoms: bacteria, archaebacteria, plants, animals, protists, and fungi, and they've actually been organized into 3 domains. So you've got bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And the last pages of the chapter show the tree of all life, which is a giant cladogram showing all of the kingdoms of life, from the beginning of life on Earth, which would be down here, and it shows in a broad scope our current ideas about how all of these organisms are related. These pages also give descriptions of the kingdoms to illustrate what factors help classify organisms into the different kingdoms. So for example, plants make their own food through photosynthesis, but fungi do not. So they're similar in some other ways, but that's the big distinction that keeps them in separate kingdoms. Archaea and bacteria are set apart because they do not have a nucleus in their cells. They are prokaryotes. Protists are an awkward group that's mostly based on the number of cells that they have. Protists are all single-celled organisms, but they aren't necessarily very closely related to each other. And then you have animals, which are multicellular, they eat food, they do not have cell walls. So these are all classifications kind of based on things at a cellular level that determine what kingdom everything is in. And so we have one last review question. Which of the following kingdoms contain only prokaryotic cells, not eukaryotes? So again, those of you that participated, awesome job. You got all your answers. Bacteria. Let me go back here. So prokaryotic cells means they have no nucleus. So our first option, protists, that's not correct. Single cells make up protists, but they are eukaryotes. They have a nucleus. But our correct answers are bacteria and archaea. So both of those are single cells, and they do not have a nucleus. That makes them prokaryotes. Okay, so they're actually in their own kingdoms and their own domains. And then we have fungus and animals, which are both multicellular eukaryotes. They're not part of the options there. So that actually brings us to the end of that section. So if you're watching this recording, this is how you can contact your instructor.